Stop accusing Tim Scott of racial heresy for being a Republican. On the day Tim Scott announced his presidential bid, Politico published a piece titled 55 Things You Need to Know About Tim Scott. By my count, 34 of those things you need to know are variations of the same thing: Tim Scott is black. Among them, his father smoked Kool menthols. Fact number 7, he and his grandfather both liked black professional wrestlers. Number 9, the senator is a fan of the 1970s funk band Cameo. Number 37, and he gets a lot of racist voicemails. Number 39. Yet, of all these Tim Scott is black facts, which range from silly to somber, my favorite is number 47. It is simply this quote: "People are fixated on my color." This should be the title of nearly every article that has been written on the South Carolina senator in recent months. People are deeply and intensely fixated on Scott's skin color. I have devoured Scott coverage lately, not because I am especially interested in his politics, which, to my left-wing sensibilities, are as regressive as they are bland, but because the news coverage of his campaign offers a peculiar and perverse window into our cultural inability to talk about black Republicans in ways that don't treat them as political curios, at best, or end in accusations of racial heresy, at worst. While white politicians are permitted to adopt a wide swath of political opinions without accusations of insanity, insincerity, or self-hatred, the window on acceptable black political discourse is extremely narrow. Politicians and political figures who don't fit neatly within tightly calibrated models of black political thought, which is to say, somewhere between the normie liberal center and the progressive fringe, are objects of exoticization that would have made a 19th-century anthropologist blush. What starts as mere curiosity often turns into assertions of betrayal. All too often, public criticism of black conservatives ends up implying that there is a difference, as Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times once implied in an infamous tweet, between being racially black and politically black. It should not be controversial to say that putting such straitjackets on permissible black political sentiment is racist. Much of the initial coverage of Scott's campaign launch was defined by a soft, stare-and-point bigotry: "Look, it's a black Republican." That is distasteful, but ultimately relatively harmless. Like the Politico piece, early articles tripped over themselves to flag and focus on Scott's race, generally at the expense of his ideas, but they mostly refrained from condemning his politics on the basis of his skin color. This has changed in recent weeks, however, as progressives have increasingly painted the black Republican senator not simply as a rarity, but as a race traitor. In May, Joy Behar, a white TV personality, told her audience on The View that Tim Scott is one of these guys. Like Clarence Thomas, who doesn't get racism. The senator, who has been vocal about his experiences of anti-black racism, rightly blasted the paternalistic comments. "It is literally the dumbest, most offensive thing I've witnessed on TV," Scott observed, "to hear these millionaire TV personalities telling me how to live my life as a black man." Though white liberals generally trip over themselves to defer to the lived experience of black Americans, it often seems that this same courtesy is rarely extended to black people who understand their own racial experience in ways that don't accord with progressive pieties. While some like Behar are content to imply that Scott is too intellectually feeble to understand racism, others have hinted at darker motivations, asserting that the senator is a well-funded race messenger whose sole purpose is to provide a smokescreen for a white supremacist Republican Party. According to this interpretation, Scott isn't stupid, he's a shill, an argument hinted at by none other than former President Barack Obama. Discussing Scott's campaign with David Axelrod this month, Obama suggested that we should understand it as part of a long history of African American or other minority candidates within the Republican Party who will validate America and say, "Everything's great, and we can all make it." While the president subsequently hedged by saying he wasn't trying to be cynical about any individual campaigner, Obama's suggestion was clear enough: Scott is manipulating his personal success to peddle a Panglossian vision of racial optimism that sells out black Americans in the service of courting conservative white voters. What is so ironic about these remarks is that Scott appears to have modeled his campaign on Obama's own successful 2008 run. Like the former president, Scott is running on a message of hope. He balances frank discussions of racist encounters he has personally experienced alongside optimism about America's racial trajectory. And he advocates the same black respectability politics that often got the former president in hot water with his progressive supporters. Brothers should pull up their pants. Yet, though both Obama and Scott have staked their brand on unapologetic optimism married to an up-by-your-bootstraps ethos, the Democrat was heralded as America's great black hope while the Republican is derided as a Benedict Arnold aligned against the black community. Bakery Sellers, a former Democratic congressman from South Carolina, seemingly voiced the perspective of many liberals when he tweeted in the wake of Obama's comments, "Watching white folk on this app have the audacity to compare the blackness of Tim Scott and Barack Obama. Some of y'all are shameless." Sellers' clear implication is that the former president is blacker because he's a Democrat. My point is not to give Scott a pass on a policy platform that likely would bode ill for working-class black Americans. My point is that it is bigoted to suggest that black legitimacy hinges on espousing left-leaning political sentiments. It is possible to criticize Scott's politics without turning that critique into a referendum on racial authenticity. White Republican politicians consistently advocate for policies that are terrible for working-class white Americans, and yet people rarely accuse those white politicians of being race traitors who are self-hating or insincere in their beliefs. Instead, their politics are debated on their merits, or rather, demerits. As a black person who frequently engages in activities that are not always coded as authentically black, I study the dead white men of the British Empire for a living and hunt and fish in my free time. I find the idea that someone's skin color should determine everything they think, do, and desire to be loathsome. As a Democrat who desperately does not want to see a Republican president elected in 2024, I worry that the progressive conversation around Scott and other conservative minorities is dangerous, politically counterproductive, and fails to grapple with the uncomfortable fact that Donald Trump increased his share of the black vote in 2020. The way progressive commentators talk about, and obsess over, Scott's incorrect racial politics further entrenches a highly curated, media-produced image of legitimate black political discourse, an image that is not always in line with a black American public that is deeply divided over topics such as affirmative action, policing reform, and other social justice issues. There is a glaring mismatch between the fairy tale that most black Americans are barn-burning left-wingers like myself, and the reality that the vast majority of black Americans identify as moderate or conservative. The way progressives are talking about the South Carolina senator will probably not play well with those voters. It is possible to disagree with Scott's politics and views on race, as I do, vehemently, without portraying him as a shill or an ignoramus who doesn't get racism. If Democrats and the liberal media fail to figure out how to do this, and soon, they are right to fear his campaign. Stop accusing Tim Scott of racial heresy for being a Republican. On the day Tim Scott announced his presidential bid, Politico published a piece titled 55 Things You Need to Know About Tim Scott. By my count, 34 of those things you need to know are variations of the same thing: Tim Scott is black. Among them, his father smoked Kool menthols. Fact number 7, he and his grandfather both liked